7:30 Central, 8:30 Pacific Time.
The problem with some wagons is that they're either too much wagon or not enough. Now there's the Mazda RX-3 rotary engine wagon. It's got Mazda's buttery smooth rotary engine, the engine that Car and Driver magazine said gives you a forward surge the likes of which is unknown in any other small car. And it's got the right size, so it can fit your family and still fit your garage. Mazda, America's first wagon with a rotary engine.
Primary coverage Tuesday at 6.
Acting under the mandate of the United States Court of Appeals, the Federal Communications Commission has ordered the Columbia Broadcasting System to provide Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm with 1/2 hour of prime airtime. The following broadcast is presented in compliance with that order. The program was recorded from 9:30 to 10 on Sunday morning, June 4th.
Good evening. I'm Nat Hentoff, moderator of tonight's press panel, Time for Shirley Chisholm. For the next half hour, we'll be talking with the first woman candidate for the presidency of the United States. Interviewing Congresswoman Chisholm will be Mary Breasted of the Village Voice, Joel Dreyfus of the New York Post, Dick Pollock, editor of More, a journalism review. Because there are no CBS newsmen on this panel, by decision of CBS, I want to make clear that each of us is here as a working journalist to interview Congresswoman Chisholm as we would any other candidate. I have no idea whether any of the members of this panel supports Ms. Chisholm's candidacy. I, for instance, though I wish her well, will be voting for another in the New York State primary. Now, that's a rather unorthodox statement for a somewhat unorthodox moderator, but it seemed rather necessary for me to make that point to clear the air, so to speak. The first question. Congresswoman Chisholm, the United States Court of Appeals in Washington considers your candidacy sufficiently substantive to have made this program possible. However, hardly any political commentator or reporter in the United States takes your candidacy seriously, and some have called you a spoiler. What does keep you in the contest? You surely don't think you have a chance for the nomination.
What really keeps me in the contest is the fact that thousands of people in America desire to have the opportunity to pull the lever besides the name of a person or besides the name of that person's delegates, a person that really has a commitment to people, first of all, not in terms of rhetoric and words, but in terms of deeds and actions. And I feel that because I meet the constitutional requirements for running for the presidency of this nation, as well as the fact that there's people all over this country who indicated to me quite clearly, not by words, but by actions and putting together different organizations, that they wanted to vote for me, I felt that I had to run in order to be able to give the people that choice. If we want change in America, I think we do have to recognize that change is not going to come about from just sitting back and taking the traditional kind of political play that has been going on in our country for some time. And so this is why I am running.
From the panel, Mary Breasted.
Mrs. Chisholm, Bella Abzug has called your candidacy a symbolic one in her book. Do you agree with that?
Well, it may be symbolic in terms of the fact that never before in the history of this country has a woman seriously run for the candidacy for the presidency of this country. So therefore, from that standpoint, it has to be regarded as symbolic. But in addition to possibly being symbolic, since a woman is running very seriously and has been doing that for the past 7 months, although many people don't want to accept this fact, I think it is a real candidacy because I would not have been going all over this country for 7 months, as contrasted to some gentleman who only started about 4 months ago running for the presidency of this country just merely for my health.
But yet you have gotten only really 3% of the popular vote. What has kept you in?
I think what has kept me in is because nobody knows what's going to happen at the convention. I think the very fact that at the convention for the first time we're going to have numerous delegates who are not there because of political machines, who are not there because of patronage, many delegates uncommitted, many delegates who are not sophisticated in the political power plays. By the time we get to that convention, and dependent on what happens before the credentials committees, that is going to be the most open Democratic convention that we've ever had in this country. Nobody is going to be able to get through on first ballot.
Joel Dreyfus.
Mrs. Chisholm, of all the candidates competing now for the Democratic nomination, you're all listed as Democrats. And I was just curious, at what major points of difference do you see between yourself in terms of your platform and what you're running on as against George McGovern or Hubert Humphrey?
Well, if you talk about George McGovern, you talk about Hubert Humphrey, we are alike in certain programs and certain projects, because all of us believe in extending the democratic principles in terms of employment and housing and education. All of us have heard that rhetoric before, but I think what makes me so different is the fact that these gentlemen have been in very important positions in this country for the past 8 years. These gentlemen, in a sense, in one way or another, have been a part of the national leadership that has brought this country to the malaise that it now finds itself in. And I am a different kind of national voice that has emerged on the American scene in terms of the fact that I'm not espoused by any kind of powerful interest groups in this country, financial or otherwise. And those who know about my candidacy and understand what I am trying to do at this hour in America recognize that I have a gut commitment to people, first of all, to the exclusion of all other interests. And I think this is what makes me so different, of course. Secondly, what makes me so different is I am a woman and I am black. Those two segments have never had an opportunity to have some input into who's going to be the chief executive of this man for a period of 4 years.
Dick Pollock.
Well, as chief executive, you would be responsible to all the people. You're entered in the California primary on Tuesday, and one of the major issues in that primary is the economic dislocation of thousands of men and women in the aerospace industry on the West Coast. Most of these men and women are white middle-class Americans, and I wondered specifically how an economic program or your economic program would deal with that plight, their plight.
I think one of the things that we have failed to do is because of the continuation of the Vietnam War for the past 8 years, we have not actually begun to prepare our economy for reconversion to the domestic affairs at home. With the thousands of unemployed engineers and technicians that we have in this country, these persons can be utilized in terms of developing programs for mass transportation, air and water pollution in this country. You need the skills and the talents and the technological know-how of engineers in this particular field. This would be in keeping with getting back to getting our domestic economy on the road at home by using these gentlemen in that particular sphere. Subsidized by the fact that the federal government should continue to create the kinds of federal programs in this country where we can utilize veterans to get the domestic war at home straightened out. I think our big difficulty right now in America is to start talking in terms of reconversion, and we're not talking about that at all.
Congresswoman Chisholm, today's New York Times has a political analysis which says that if George McGovern wins in California on Tuesday, it'll be practically impossible to stop him at the convention. In the event he should win the nomination of the Democratic Party, would you support him?
I don't know whom I would support, because I do not feel, and this is my own humble opinion, I do not feel that George McGovern is going to win on the first ballot. I just came back from Florida yesterday. They're getting ready to have the governor's conference down there with governors, labor leaders, and many other people, and I know what's going on, and I do not feel that he would win on the first ballot at all. I don't even know if anybody out here running now would win. All I'm saying is that I, myself, personally, am not going to be making any unilateral decisions. I will be guided very, very specifically by a broadly based advisory board that I will have with me at the convention. This is going to be an open convention. No one is talking about the most important thing at this convention this year, and that is what is really going to happen in terms of the challenges that are going to be brought before the Credentials Committee. And some of those challenges that will be brought before the Credentials Committee is going to affect McGovern, Humphrey, and all of us. And so I think that this is why I keep saying that this is going to be an open convention.
Would you consider a vice presidential or a cabinet position if you were offered one by, say, Senator McGovern?
There are all kinds of options in terms of all of us running for the nomination for the presidency on the Democratic ticket. Of course, people always have to think in terms of alternatives. I wouldn't say no, I wouldn't consider it, but again, I would say I would be influenced a great deal by the people who surround me.
Do you think you will be in such a bargaining position at the convention?
I have never really been in any bargaining positions in terms of the so-called traditional way of operating at conventions, but I've always been able to be an instrument to be reckoned with. And all I can say is that I have alternatives. I have a few trump cards at my chest that I am going to use when I get to the convention. It has nothing to do with delegates. Delegates or no delegates, we're going to have to be reckoned with in terms of being an instrument for peoples who've never had any input. I've never been regarded as serious. Even now, people don't regard me as serious. I'm always at the bottom of every poll. Everyone says it's 5,000 to 1. I'm going to do anything. I never would have gotten to the New York State Assembly, the United States Congress, if I listened to all of the political prognostications. So once again, all I'm going to say is that I have some ideas which I think I will be able to implement at the convention. That's all I can say at this particular moment.
Mrs. Chisholm, you seem to pin a great deal of hope on the openness of this year's convention and the fact that the selection of delegates has been radically changed. But in terms of the popular vote, and I would imagine that the delegates, the attempt to change delegation is to make it more responsive to the little people. Mm-hmm. The little people just haven't been voting for you in great numbers. And I'm just curious on what you expect to get out of the convention in this light.
Well, first of all, you can't expect the little people or any people at all to vote for me in tremendous numbers. I'm doing something in this country that has never been done before. This is why everybody is so psychologically shocked that I'm still in the race, because I don't have money, I don't have endorsers. I'm still trudging along, although some who had endorsers dropped out along the wayside, some who had a great deal of money dropped out along. My candidacy cannot be contrasted in terms of delegates, in terms of anything else. This is a kind of movement within the system, if you will. And I think that we are going to be in for some great big eye-openers at that convention. In fact, I know that, and I'm just saying that right now on this particular program. If I always decided on delegates, if I always decided on support, if I decided on many, many things, I would still be a teacher in the schoolroom. I never would have become assemblywoman or congresswoman. My candidacy cannot be contrasted to be it's a movement. It's a very different kind of thing. Because I'm black, doesn't mean that black people are going to suddenly rally behind my candidacy. Because I'm a woman, it doesn't mean that women are going to suddenly rally behind my candidacy. I am a catalyst for change within the Democratic Party, and as such, will be able to go to that convention, delegates or no delegates, to put some kind of input to make this country recognize that there are other kinds of peoples that have to be considered in terms of putting a total ticket together. And I have to say that if you're going to evaluate me just solely on the basis of delegates, well then let's forget the whole business. I would have gotten out long ago.
Dick Pollock?
Well, I'd like to get back to the whole notion of reconversion. You said that one of the most important issues before the Republic today is the reconversion of a war economy to a peace economy. But how would you, specifically, how would you bring that about, say, in the aerospace industry? What does your economic program say in comparison to Senator McGovern's?
Well, I would say that, first of all, we have to restructure the manpower training programs and the Department of Labor in this country. I mean, we restructure those programs in this way. We would have to have a much closer coordination with the state employment agencies throughout this country, because the accessibility and availability of jobs that are going begging in particular communities can be received by those in these agencies as to what kind of training is necessary, what kind of reconversion is necessary. And then the manpower training programs will be set up in terms of the availability of the jobs in that particular area that are going begging to help the people in terms of employment. But our approach has been always a fragmented, piecemeal approach. Senator McGovern and Senator Humphrey and everybody is saying we're going to get more jobs. I'm going to do this. But unless we have a coordination between your state employment agencies, between your regional commissions as to the kinds of training that is necessary in those communities, we're still not going to be able to do something about the employment in different regions throughout this country. For example, in about 5 areas of this country, I have found they have fantastic manpower training programs. But when the individuals come out of the programs in those particular areas, the talents and the skills that they have been able to secure in these programs are absolutely useless in those particular areas of the country because there's no coordination. So what I am saying is that I would restructure manpower training programs and Department of Labor programs in terms of training and getting skills for people directly with the state employment agencies throughout this country. There's no other way that you can begin to move into employment that is meaningful in a region and the accessibility of jobs in that region unless you coordinate instead of this fragmented approach that we have to everything.
As a catalyst for change within the Democratic Party, What was your reaction to the priorities listed a few days ago by the Black Caucus, the black members of the House? They said, as you know, that if those priorities were not met by the Democratic Party, they might not support the presidential candidate. Did you share in the drawing up of the list? Would you go along with that decision if they ever make it?
I shared in the drawing up of some of the things on the list, and this is why I keep saying that this convention is going to be very open. The Congressional Black Caucus and many other black leaders in this country, whether or not they're supporting me, is not the issue. The fact of the matter is people don't even know the agenda of lots of groups that are coming to this convention. All they're saying is that, if a certain candidate wins California or what have you, he's going over the top. That's why I keep saying that I know none of us are running that's not going to go over the top on that first ballot. There are lots of forces that are going to be at that convention that are going to make sure that certain things are put into that platform. If these things are not put into the platform, we'll do what we have to do, and this is all I'm saying. And many of the things that the Congressional Black Caucus have brought forth now in this latest document is an indication that we are not going to be taken for granted any longer by the Democratic Party, although we are 25% of the vote, that we're going to have some very meaningful things to say in terms of the platform, in terms of what the candidates are going to do when they become president. And so this is why I continue to say that this thing is not locked up just in terms of delegates alone at all.
Mary Briskin.
Mrs. Chisholm, this is a totally different subject, but you said in Atlanta, Georgia, that if you were elected president, you would use executive fiat more frequently than any other president had in the past. Could you explain that statement?
Yes, there are things that the president of this country can do in terms of emergencies as he sees it. For example, with the unemployment rising in this country, the fact of the matter is that it has been indicated that any time there is a better than 6% unemployment throughout this nation, that is a grave emergency, and that is a crisis. And the president, as the chief executive of this land, would not have to relate to the judicial or legislative branches in terms of what has to be done to overcome this real crisis if there is a commitment to what needs to be done at that particular moment regarding employment and training. This is seldom used because of the fact that most programs have to secure legislative approval. But the executive of this land does have the opportunity to use the executive fiat when he, in his own wisdom, with the advice of his counsel, feels that this country is really at the crossroads of a fantastic emergency, and it is at an emergency crisis right now. It is not used as a regular method of solving our problems in this country, however.
But he still has to go to the Congress to raise the money.
Yes, he has to go to the Congress.
I don't think there's much time left. I was going to raise the subject of busing.
Right.
I'd like to hear how you feel on that.
Yes, certainly. I think that's, unfortunately, that issue has been used by one candidate in a very dramatic way in order to be able to get people to go to the polls to vote for or against busing and not looking at the other candidates that ran in certain states, because that was the issue. It's a life or death matter. Busing is one of the artificial instruments that the Supreme Court has said must be utilized for quality integrated education in this country. If we had open housing in this country and the neighborhoods would have been reflective of the children, we wouldn't have had to talk about busing. But busing is not new. Busing has been going on in this country for years. Black children have been bused right past neighborhood schools that everybody's talking about right now in the southern part of this country. But nobody said anything about it at that time.
On that cogent point, I'm afraid we have to end. Interviewing the first woman candidate for the presidency of the United States have been Mary Breasted of the Village Voice, Joel Dreyfus of the New York Post, and Dick Pollock, editor of More, a journalism review. We would have been delighted to have a reporter from CBS News among us, but alas, no one came. I'm Nat Hentoff. Thank you and good night.
Have you planned all of your Monday holidays yet? It's a great place to visit.
This is the CBS.
You know, as far back as 1961, we were telling you that Laura Scudder's potato chips are the noisiest chips in the world. Today, they're still the noisiest chips in the world.
Today is Hope Sunday. Let's all give to the City of Hope.
Regularly scheduled programs will not be seen at this time, so that we may bring you the following one-hour special edition of Issues and Answers. From Los Angeles, Senator Hubert Humphrey, Democrat of Minnesota. General Taylor Hardin, representative of Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Senator George McGovern, Democrat of South Dakota. Mayor Sam Yorty of Los Angeles. And from New York City, Representative Shirley Chisholm, Democrat of New York. From Los Angeles, California and New York City, the American Broadcasting Company brings you an hour-long special edition of the award-winning interview program, Issues and Answers. The candidates in the important California primary next Tuesday, June 6th, will be interviewed by ABC News Capitol Hill correspondent Sam Donaldson, ABC News correspondent Bill Matney, and ABC News special correspondent Frank Reynolds.
I want to welcome each of you and all of you to this special edition of Issues and Answers. Before we begin, let me take just a moment to say that ABC News originally had invited Senator McGovern and Senator Humphrey, the two leading candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, to appear on this program. Friday night, the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, D.C. ruled that Mrs. Chisholm must also be invited to participate. ABC News then agreed to earlier requests for appearances from Mayor Yorty and the campaign headquarters of Governor George Wallace. That explains why this expanded cast is here today and why Mrs. Chisholm is with us in New York. One question that we want to put to each of you, gentlemen, and Mrs. Chisholm, it may seem innocuous for some of you, but perhaps for others not. Will you pledge today to support the nominee of the Democratic Convention? And would you limit your answer, please, to just 1 minute? Senator Humphrey, we'll begin with you.
Yes, of course, I will pledge to support the nominee of the Democratic Party at its national convention, because I think it is of the utmost importance for this nation that there be a change in administration. I think the Democratic Party will be able to pull itself together to place before the American people a strong ticket. I intend to lead that ticket, to carry the case for tax reform to the American people, to end this war to the American people, to return our prisoners of war as we end this war, to bring about a rebuilding of our cities, to reconstruct this economy so that jobs are available and people do not have to suffer the pains of the tragedy of unemployment, and to start to do something about the basic human needs of this country in education, in health, the care of children, and an adequate pension and dignity for our elderly.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardin, you represent Governor Wallace.
Mr. Reynolds, I think that I occupy a rather unique role here today, and the question which you posed is more or less a personal question. So let me answer in this regard, if I might. Since last fall, and certainly since the first of the year, Governor Wallace has directed his sole attention and his activities toward nothing else other than the Democratic nomination for the presidency. He has given his all, as you know, toward that end. He now finds himself less than a month away from that convention. He still considers him a most viable candidate. You referred to the two leading candidates. I think there are three leading candidates I might mention. Certainly in popular vote, one. In delegate votes, he's number two, as I understand it. The question which you ask is personal to him, and I cannot conceive of all the foreseeable events of the convention or what might take place, so an irrefutable answer I would not like to give. But I would like to say to you that the governor has nothing else in his mind. He has devoted himself to nothing more than the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and that is a course I am sure he will pursue.
Senator McGovern.
Mr. Reynolds, it's my present inclination to support the nominee of the Democratic Party, just as I did in 1968. I think I can say that with even greater confidence in 1972, because the whole delegate selection process by which we select the Democratic nominee is much more open and more representative this year than it was 4 years ago. I'm confident we're going to have a convention in Miami Beach that will be fairly representative of all groups in the country. It'll be fairly well divided between men and women. It'll have fair representation for black people, for Mexican Americans, for young people. Under those circumstances, I think the nominee will be the person who is most broadly representative of the interests and the concerns of the Democratic Party. I will intend to support that person.
Mary Yorty.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I've been a Democrat all my life, but I'm not a professional Democrat, and I reserve the right to use my own thinking power to make a decision. I'm not going to sign a blank check just to support any Democrat who happens to get nominated, because I'm very interested in the defense of the United States, in our military establishment, to see that it's adequate. I'm very interested in jobs for Californians. Some of the senators here today voted against the American Supersonic Transport Program. It costs us 150,000 jobs in aerospace. And it'd be different if they were really killing supersonic transports, but the Russians are now showing theirs at airfairs and trying to sell them. The British and French have 5 orders, 10 really, for theirs. So I'm interested first in the defense of this country and in the economy, the state of California and the nation, and I'm going to wait and see who the candidates are.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mrs. Chisholm?
I cannot support just any candidate who will be nominated by the Democratic Party merely because it's just a Democratic nominee. I think it's very important for us to understand that even before we get to the convention, before the nomination of the presidency gets under at that convention, that there are going to be some very important credential challenges that will be raised at that convention this year in terms of groups that have never really had any real input. And although we did have a structure and a mechanism for the broadest kind of participation within our democratic system, we already have quite a number of states with challenges which do not exactly follow that. So much of what we will do will depend on that nominee's gut commitment to the broadest kind of representation and as to how those credentials are going to be settled when they're challenged at the convention, not a blank check.
Thank you, Mrs. Chisholm. Well, as I read it here, we have 5 contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination, only 2 of whom will actively or openly profess to support the nominee. Mr. Hardin, you are the personal representative of Governor Wallace on this program. Are you able to say that Governor Wallace will not pledge his support to President Nixon?
That he will not pledge his support to President Nixon? I cannot conceive of that happening, Mr. Reynolds.
Senator McGovern, you talked about an open convention, and of course the new rules and the new selection process were part of your own commission. You said a while back that you would challenge delegations that did not follow those rules. As you know, Mayor Daley of Chicago has said in these exact words, "To hell with the rules." His delegation is being challenged, but you have not done so. 2 questions. Why did you not challenge Mayor Daley's delegation? And do you, in fact, support the challenge that others have taken?
Well, Mr. Donaldson, I don't subscribe to the view to hell with the rules, obviously. I'm going to do everything I can as a member of that Democratic convention in 1972 to see that every challenge has a fair hearing. I'm not a part of the challenge to Mayor Daley's delegates in Chicago. I made that decision because we had no McGovern delegates that were contesting the mayor's delegates in Chicago. If I had made the choice some months ago to run McGovern slates in Chicago, and I felt that those slates had been defeated by unfairly selected delegates, we'd be in there participating in the challenge. Now, I'm not opposed to the challenge that's being brought in Chicago. It's simply not my challenge. I've said that I want them to get a fair hearing. I don't know all the merits of the challenge presently being brought in Chicago, but it's entitled to a fair hearing. It's entitled to be heard all the way up to the convention itself. And when we get a clear picture of the merits, I'll cast my influence on the side that I think is right.
Just to nail this down, to those people who might say that you are not challenging him because you are afraid of offending Mayor Daley, who may be important in the convention, what is your answer to that?
Well, I'd just have to say to those people that from the very beginning, as the chairman of the Reform Commission, I've taken the political risks involved in lending my name to 28 new guidelines that were not very popular with some people in this country. All of them were not popular with Mayor Daley or with other party leaders, but we held our ground. We came out with what we think is a practical and fair way of selecting the delegates to our party, and I'm going to stand by them. It is not my personal responsibility to bring challenges in every state in the Union where I think something may be out of line. If there are other challenge slates, bringing those challenges, and at some point I have a chance to help, I'll join in that effort if I think there's a good case.
Senator, there is one other aspect of this Chicago challenge I would like to get clarified here. One of the leaders of the Daley Challenge is Reverend Jesse Jackson, who is here in California today campaigning for you. He indicates that he will take this challenge to the convention floor, and I have been informed that many of your own delegates, black and white, in New York, California, Louisiana, South Carolina, to name a few states, will support that challenge. Now, will you support your own people in this challenge if it goes to the floor?
Those delegates are free, of course, to support the challenge if they wish. I talked to Reverend Jackson. I've talked to Alderman Singer from Chicago, who is one of the leading challengers involved in this effort. Both of them told me that they wanted to proceed on their own. They didn't request my help. But if at some point I think they're not getting a fair hearing, I'll step in to do what I can to be helpful. Now, I can't make these judgments finally. Finally, they're made by the Credentials Committee and the delegates to the 1972 convention.
Can we move
but
on?
I will have one voice there, and I'll use it on the side of justice when it comes to the seating of delegates.
Well, I know you want to move on, but I'd like to ask Senator Humphrey, why didn't you make some effort to challenge Mayor Daley? Or do you believe that it is not...
a single delegate in Illinois. I hope to get some, and I think the case ought to be heard by the Credentials Committee. We have an excellent Credentials Committee. Patricia Harris, a distinguished lawyer, ambassador of quality, is the chairman or the chairwoman of that Credentials Committee.
Isn't that passing the buck?
Not passing the buck at all.
Tell us what your personal view is.
Not until you get the evidence.
Delegation.
Not until you get the evidence, Mr. Donaldson. I think a man would be unworthy of public trust if he started to prejudge a case before the evidence was in.
We know there aren't enough blacks, according to the McGovern rules, enough young people, according to the McGovern rules, enough women on the delegation. Isn't there a prima facie case that you can
That I don't know, Mr. Donaldson. You may know that, but frankly, I did not know that. And may I say that the state of Minnesota was the first state to abide by all the new rules. I recommended Senator Harris as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. I helped appoint the McGovern Commission that made these reforms. I stand by those reforms, but I do not believe that we ought to be judging people in the public print or on a television show before somebody's had a chance to present their case. Now, we put up a Credentials Committee, and the Credentials Committee is a good one. And the Credentials Committee is the product of a reform convention. And I think they'll make a decent ruling, and I will support the ruling of the Credentials Committee.
All right, let's go on, if we may, now to another topic that I know is of perhaps wider interest. After your last debate the other night, Senator McGovern and Senator Humphrey, I got a telegram from a lady in California, and I'd like to read part of it to you. As a 7-year POW wife, I found Senators Humphrey and McGovern's answers on the POW issue on last evening's program sadly lacking. She then goes on to suggest a few questions, and I want to put this one to you, Senator Humphrey. The lady says, please ask Senator Humphrey if he agrees or disagrees that President Nixon's present action in Vietnam is the only realistic avenue he can pursue toward the safe return of American POWs and the accounting of Americans missing in action. I might just add that she says, please do not read my name on the air because I've received some very unpleasant mail about this. But what's your answer to that?
It's my judgment that President Nixon, in his most recent statement, said that we were prepared, once there was an agreement upon the prisoners of war release, to withdraw all forces from Vietnam, all forces. He removed any part or discussion about the quality or the formation of the government in South Vietnam. In other words, he tied down the release of the prisoners with a simultaneous, or the removal of our forces with a simultaneous release of the prisoners. That's my position. Now let me give you a suggestion. I want President Nixon to immediately proceed, since he has been to Peking and Moscow himself, to immediately proceed to send a high-level administration emissary to Hanoi to work out the release of these prisoners. And I might suggest that a man of the firmness and strength and the quality of a former cabinet officer, John Connally, be the man. Send him to Hanoi to see if we can't pin down what President Nixon said he would do, namely, withdraw all of our forces, conditioned upon the release of our prisoners of war and the missing in action. I would not, by the way, leave those prisoners of war there if I'm the president. I would not permit our prisoners of war to rot in prison simply because we're removing all forces from Vietnam. I think that Hanoi must know that the price is release of the prisoners of war for the removal of American forces.
And your proposal is to send John Connally to Hanoi?
I think he's the type of man, maybe somebody else, but I think he has the strength and the ability to do a job.
Have you talked to Governor Connally? I know I'm taking up too much time.
No, I have not, but I think that this is the kind of a man we need. He's tough, he's firm, he knows what's going on, and I believe that he could be of great use.
Mr. Matney?
I'd like to direct a question to Mayor Yorty. Wilbur Mills said today he's suspicious of the recent Moscow agreements because the Soviets obviously are gleeful over what they got. Senator Jackson says he doesn't like the limited arms pact. Do you support the president's action?
Well, first of all, let me say that, I hope you said 1 minute answers, then you take 10 minutes almost on that delegation.
Mayor Yorty, I said 1 minute on
I would
the
like to
first
comment
answer.
on the prisoners of war. I'm the only one here wearing a prisoner of war bracelet. I'm the only one that met with them in Nebraska. They wrote me a letter and said, we ask all the candidates, you're the only one met with us. I think that the only way you're going to get the prisoners of war back is to put the pressure on the communists. I don't believe in appeasement. I wouldn't take their promises. And certainly I approve of what is happening in Vietnam now because I recommended it in 1965. This is a copy of a speech I made here in Los Angeles, which I said the port of Haiphong should be closed. I went to President Johnson and asked him to take professional military advice and close that port. And I think if he had done it, it would certainly have been easier then. We wouldn't be discussing the war here today. But at long last, President Nixon, belatedly, because as far as I'm concerned, I would have bombed the supplies north of the DMZ before they came through there, and I asked that it be done. But he, again, didn't take professional military advice. But now it's a clear invasion, and he has taken the action that he felt necessary, and I wish all these Democratic candidates would say, well, on this issue, let's be Americans first, let's take it out of partisan politics, back what he's doing, and then discuss economics and some of the other issues where I think Nixon is very vulnerable.
The Mayor, you were asked about the SALT agreements, and perhaps we can get back to that later on. But I think as long as we're still on Vietnam, what is Governor Wallace's program to secure the release of the American prisoners?
Governor Wallace, as the mayor said, it's his position. We support the present action being taken. We believe that the pressure should be put on the enemy. Initially, the governor's position was, and always has been, that any time American forces are committed to battle, that they should have the full support of the American people, the all-out support in material and morale facets, that everything should be put behind our men in combat.
So you support the
once a decision is made that that full support is not going to be rendered, then we think the troops should be withdrawn. But the governor feels, and he feels very strongly, and I was going to mention the governor and his wife both have worn on their arms for quite some while the prisoner of war bracelets. We have several from the state of Alabama. He feels that is an absolute essential. Any agreement or termination of this war must be conditioned upon the return of the POWs and the MIAs, the missing in action.
Mrs. Chisholm?
Well, all I can say is that for over 8 years, this war has been continuing, and the many investigatory committees and even military personnel has come back to this country and indicated that this is a war that the United States cannot win. And with all of the meetings that have been going on in Paris, I think we have to realize that an error has been made, and that to the extent that we can get our men out of Vietnam as quickly as possible, the pressure of the Geneva Convention and world opinion would cause something to be done with respect to the release of our prisoners. If we're going to wait on the predication that the prisoners should be released before we end the war, we are going to continue to accumulate many more American boys as prisoners of war. We're dealing with a very ruthless enemy here, and there has been no indication at all that prisoners are going to be released. Meanwhile, more American boys are being taken prisoners every day, and they're being incarcerated under the most inhumane and abominable conditions. I think we just have to say, let's get out of there, at the same time continuing the negotiation for the release of the prisoners, recognizing that more and more prisoners are being taken each day in that war in which over 50,000 lives have been lost already.
Well,
65% of the American people have said that they want out. This crosses class lines, sex lines, race lines, economic lines. This is government of the people. The American people have spoken, and I think that should be the criteria.
Well, Mrs. Chisholm, I'm not sure that we're completely clear. Would you take all the troops out before the prisoners are returned?
Yes, I would take all the troops out because I believe that the pressure of world opinion would further cause the release of those prisoners as fast as possible. We have been in Paris, for 2 or 3 years now, sitting around those different tables, negotiating and trying to have something said to us by the enemy with respect to the release of our prisoners, and absolutely nothing has been said to this point. How much longer can we go on fooling ourselves?
I want to refer back to this telegram that the lady sent to me the other day, and there was, of course, a reference to you in it too, Senator McGovern. This is what she says, on what evidence does Senator McGovern base his assumption that POWs will be released by North Vietnamese after the American troop withdrawals? I submit that he has no right to risk my husband's life on his assumptions. What's your response?
Mr. Reynolds, first of all, I agree 100% with what Representative Chisholm has just said. She is talking common sense on this issue. It's clear now that we're not going to get our prisoners released if we stay on this present military course. Each new day brings another American prisoner. Now, I think the President has done us a great disservice in leaving the implication that if we just keep bombing and dropping mines and maintaining our military support for General II, that's going to bring about the release of our prisoners. Obviously, it will do just the opposite. It means that more men are held in prison and that the locks on those cells are made tighter. So there's only one way that we can hold out any hope for the release of our prisoners. That's to end the war, withdraw our forces, terminate military aid to General II, and then we have to go on the faith that we have after every previous war, that once the fighting is stopped, the prisoners will be released. No one can guarantee that, but what we can guarantee is that as long as we stay there, our prisoners are going to stay in their cells.
May I ask you and Mrs. Chisholm, since you have a similar position, a question, if you would give us a short answer. If your faith is not vindicated, if Hanoi does not release the prisoners or haggles over the release, what action are you prepared to take?
Well, the first thing, Mr. Donaldson, we're no worse off with the prisoners than we are now. I think you'd agree with that. They're still in jail in either case. Secondly, we then can take our case to the international community with more force than we can at a time when we're carrying the attack to North Vietnam and continuing a military presence which most of the rest of the world does not support.
Mrs. Chisholm, could we have
Yes, I think that we have to recognize what has happened in terms of past involvements that our country has been in. And at the end of these involvements, we've always found that most of our prisoners have been released. I think we are negating the importance of the pressure of world opinion after a war is ended.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Chisholm.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude, but what if you are wrong? And I'm not saying you are, but what if you are wrong and the prisoners are not released? As President of the United States, what action would you take?
The only action that I could take would be to constantly try to negotiate for the release of the prisoners. And the very fact of the matter is that the prisoners are still there in Vietnam, although we have been negotiating for the past 3 years in Paris. So it doesn't make any difference. It seems to me that in this situation, before we get any more prisoners, we may as well get out of the war, and hoping that the pressure of world opinions will help us to get the release of our prisoners, because we have no evidence right now that that is uppermost in the minds of the enemy that we've been dealing with in Paris for the past few years.
Senator Humphrey?
I think there are other options, and I cannot agree with Senator McGovern and Mrs. Chisholm on this of leaving those prisoners there. This is where we do disagree. First of all, we have not used the facilities of the United Nations as a good office to try to get those prisoners out of there, and we should. Secondly, we should set a firm date of withdrawal of American forces. That date should be given to this presidential emissary, unmistakable, clear date. That presidential emissary should take that date directly to Hanoi and say that within these perimeters of whatever the date may be, the president said 4 months, within that period of time, we are prepared to withdraw all of our forces if simultaneously the prisoners of war are released. Now, why throw in the sponge ahead of time? What you're really saying here is we're going to get out and hope that the prisoners of war are going to be released. I don't think there's any evidence that Hanoi will keep that agreement. But I do think there is evidence that you can go and use the force of the world community, the United Nations, Peking, the Soviet Union, our own personal emissary to Hanoi, and try to lay it on the line and end this miserable war and get those prisoners of war out of there.
Mr. Matney?
Gentlemen and Mrs. Chisholm, I'd like to move on to another question, and I'd like to address this to Mr. Hardin. George Wallace was quoted some weeks ago as saying that blacks would support him if they got to know him better. Now, what has happened to Mr. Wallace, the governor, to change his basic opinion on race relations, and so forth? What has changed him to make him say that?
May I revise your question? I don't think that Governor Wallace's position has changed whatsoever. Perhaps what he says is true. When you come to know him better, that this impression people have disappears. And I think what he says is absolutely true, and I think we find it true to a large extent in the state of Alabama because of the many of the things he's done there in the way of educational opportunities for people of all races, the compassion he has for people of all races, the facilities that he's provided through state government for peoples of all races. And I have known this gentleman for 35 years, I guess. I have never heard him one time base a decision or an opinion on race.
Has he initiated immigration?
I think that what he says is absolutely true. The secret lies in coming to know him better and know his positions better.
Well, Mr. Hardin, has he then revoked the statement he delivered in his inaugural speech of some years ago when he said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever?
Well, I think that that has been revoked by many intervening events. We know, you and I and all of us, that segregation is not here today, it's not here tomorrow, and it's probably gone forever. So we certainly know that segregation is no longer an issue in this country whatsoever. So it called for no self-revocation whatsoever. I think that position has been revoked on the part of everyone.
One issue that does remain rather heated Mr. Hardin, is the question of busing. And I'm curious to know what must be in the Democratic platform and what must the stance of the Democratic nominee be on this question of busing in order to keep the governor in the fold.
Let's broaden it a bit there. Busing, of course, is a very burning issue to the people in many states. In Wisconsin it certainly was, in Michigan it was, in Florida it was, to a certain extent in this state it is. But I think that Governor Wallace's opinions on these matters have been predicated on a larger base, and that is the federal interference with the local control of public schools. And this has been with him throughout his period of public service. I think that busing in his mind and in the minds of most of the people with whom I've discussed this matter is that this is symbolic and probably points up the epitome of interference.
Well, are you going to require that the Democratic Party platform make a statement against school busing?
I don't know that we can require the Democratic Party platform to do anything, but I would think that the Democratic Party platform of its own initiative, if it seeks a successful election in the fall, certainly should include something relating to the freedom from interference with public schools.
Mayor Yorty, let's start with you now and change the subject and go to the Mideast. And to open the discussion, if you were president, would you commit under any circumstances, so tell us what they are, U.S. combat or support troops in a shooting war in the Mideast?
Well, I would if it meant that Israel was going to be defeated and the great energy sources of the Middle East fall under the domination of the Soviets. There's a good chance this may happen anyway because the Soviet Navy and military force is very strong. They're very strong in the Mediterranean now. They have air bases all along the southern rim of the Mediterranean. I'm not even sure our fleet could get out of there in a conflict. And I'm sure of one thing, that if you accept Senator McGovern's cuts in national defense, we will be so weak and our credibility so low that Israel will be in very great danger. Now, I've studied this area for a long time. I wrote a series of articles for the Hearst newspapers on it in 1955. And what I said then is happening today. I went to President Johnson again. I urged him to stop the support of the United States for the refugee camps there. I said they're nothing but a hotbed of subversion, and they're going to start a war. And I think I had him pretty sold on that idea, but the American people did not even know that we were paying 70% of the cost of keeping those refugees in those camps where they hated us. When I went and talked to the refugees and I said, here we're paying so much of your cost and you don't even appreciate it. And they said, no, it's Truman's fault. He caused that, and you ought to pay it. And so they were thoroughly unreasonable.
Well, would you come to come to the defense of Israel with American arms and military personnel?
If necessary, but I'll tell you something that's not very much discussed. I don't think it's going to be necessary. In my opinion, the Israelis have atomic weapons. And I think before they're driven into the sea, they'll unleash them. And that's why that's a very...
Do you have the evidence?
It's a very dangerous area.
On what evidence do you base that statement?
Well, I have evidence. And
can you tell us what it is? Or
no, I can't. But I have talked to some very prominent Israelis, and you know, they helped build the nuclear weapons for the French.
Could we take the
and
next
you know,
question?
they've got the skills. They've got a place there at Technion University at Haifa.
Could we take the question I posed to you and move down the line? Senator McGovern, would you commit combat troops?
Well, Mr. Donaldson, General Dayan, the great commander of the Israelis, has said the greatest mistake Israel could make would be to request American troops. He went on to say that he could not foresee any circumstance under which American forces would be requested in the Middle East. Now, I don't see any point in doing a lot of saber rattling about what we're going to do to the Russians if they intervene further in the Middle East. I do think we have to make it clear that we're going to meet the legitimate request that Israel has made, which is the right to purchase American jet aircraft and other military equipment. They have one of the finest, most devoted armies in the history of this world. They don't need American troops. What they do need are the tools to provide for their own defense, and that's what we ought to provide.
Sir, you have partially ducked my question.
No, I haven't.
If General Dayan changes his mind, and if Israel is under very grave attack, would you commit
If there's
troops?
a major Soviet invasion of the Middle East, of course we'd have to do what is necessary to meet it.
Or against the Arabs?
Or against any other independent country. We'd have to respond. I don't think that's going to happen. And I want to say, in response to Mayor Yorty's comment about my defense views, I leave enough nuclear power and conventional power in the Mediterranean under the budget I've proposed to overwhelm anything that the Soviets have even thought about putting into the Mediterranean, including an aircraft carrier task force, the greatest concentration of nuclear power ever assembled on any fleet at any time in history. We're perfectly capable of responding if we have to with the Sixth Fleet.
Well, let me just add there that what the senator's proposing is a resort to nuclear power that might not be necessary if we maintain our conventional power. And he is not right. We do not have overwhelming conventional power in the Middle East. That is a misstatement.
Go ahead, Senator Humphrey, yes.
This is the critical area of the world, the Middle East. And here is where our national interests are really involved. The underbelly of NATO is there. That's all of the Mediterranean. And Israel is a loyal friend and a great democracy. And it merits our full and wholehearted support. Now, the way to prevent the possibility, Mr. Donaldson, of your question having to be answered in the affirmative is to see, number one, that our defenses are adequate. And Senator McGovern, the fact is that the Sixth Fleet will not be strong enough, with conventional forces in particular, to really give a good accounting of itself. Now, we took 7 aircraft carriers in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Senator McGovern's defense cuts would reduce all of our aircraft carriers to 6. And that will mean that there's 1 really left for the Sixth Fleet. Furthermore, the senator has not supported in the Congress of the United States the commitments and the resources which Israel needs. Now, he voted against the defense procurement bill, Senator McGovern, that would have provided $500 million worth of credits for Israel for materiel for its defense.
The senator knows why, because it also contained funds for the war in Indochina, which he chided me on the last debate for voting for.
Senator,
gentlemen, before...
wait a minute, but Senator, may I say that when it came to the defense appropriations that included funds for Vietnam, you voted for that despite your warrior interest
and the senator objected to that.
Your opposition to Vietnam.
Yes, but didn't you object to that when I voted against the defense appropriations?
I think you're inconsistent. You voted against the $300 million for Israel. You voted against the $85 million for Israel. You voted against the $50 million for Israel. Now, gentlemen, those are votes. Those are final votes. Well, and I must say that the Israelis must be wondering now, just a minute, what kind of a bill do we have to get up in Congress?
Well, I hate to break up a good scrap. Mrs. Chisholm, we'll get to you in a moment if we may. But Senator Humphrey has partially ducked my question also. if necessary, or under any circumstances, rather, would you commit U.S. ground troops or support troops in the Mideast?
If our NATO alliance, if our NATO allies are threatened, if there's an attack, wait a minute, the Middle East involves NATO, Mr. Donaldson.
Quite right, sir, but you know I'm talking about Israel and the Arab lands.
My judgment is that we ought to be prepared at all times to take whatever action may be necessary. But it would be very foolish on the part of a man in this program to start to say that we're ready to go to war tomorrow morning in a particular set of circumstances. Israel has never asked for an American man. They've never asked for an American division, and you know it and I know it. Why try to put Israel in the position now as if she's seeking American forces? We should be prepared to take whatever steps may be necessary to defend our national interest, to fulfill our treaty requirements and treaty.
We have no treaty with Israel.
With NATO. We have in the southern flank of NATO. And I say that if we have the forces present and we don't weaken NATO, and if we have the NATO forces in proper strength, and if we give Israel the means of her defense, listen, she can take care of anybody.
Well, Senator
Israel
Humphrey,
has had no trouble taking care of
the reason. I'm going to get to Mrs. Chisholm, and you've been very patient, Mrs. Chisholm. Indeed, you have.
Yes, she has.
But you know, gentlemen, one of the reasons we raise this question, and we put it in terms, is because we've heard from you, Senator Humphrey, and from you, Senator McGovern, particularly, no more Vietnams. And we're trying to find out what are the conditions under which you would commit American troops.
I have given you an answer. There's a lot of difference between Vietnam, where we have very little national interest as I see it, compared to a solemn treaty with NATO that includes the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean is a part of North Africa. The Mediterranean is a part of the Middle East. And we are involved there, and we have treaty commitments.
Well, don't we have a treaty commitment with Southeast Asia?
We have protocols, but no signed treaties to the degree that we have with NATO.
Well, what happened to this treaty that we heard about for so many years that was the justification for our going into
that
Vietnam?
That was an understanding between President Eisenhower, may I say, and the government of South Vietnam. But you know the difference between NATO, which is the Grand Alliance, and the treaty commitments that we have, or the protocols, as they call them, that we have with Southeast Asia. You ask me what my point of view is. I consider the Middle East the most critical area of the world. And I say that we ought to be prepared to defend ourselves there, but nobody in his right mind would be starting to declare a premature war to answer a question of Mr. Donaldson's.
Mrs. Chisholm?
Yes, I'd like to give my viewpoints on this situation. I think it's very important to recognize, as Dr. Chaim Weizmann said, there's not one right or one wrong in this entire Middle East situation. We constantly skirt the whole question of humanitarianism in the Middle East. We know that it was a moral obligation for the creation of the Jewish state back in 1948. But in the process of creating this state, which was very necessary for the Jewish people, all of the world powers forgot what was necessary to do with the thousands of Palestinians who live in that area. You just can't wish them away from the face of the earth. I think it's important that we include them in the negotiations, or we're going to continue to have in the Middle East an escalation of inflamed passions. There are generations of Palestinians now that have never known nothing else but the refugee camps and the food packages. We can't constantly feel that we're going to be able to solve the problems of the world in terms of talking about arms or jets. The humanitarian aspect of this entire situation in the Middle East has never been handled by the world powers. We're always talking about, well, are you for jets for Israel, or are you for something for the Arabian Peninsula? What Russia and the United States needs to do, both of them, to get out of the Middle East and let the Arabian Peninsula and the Israelis settle their question, because so long as you have Russia on one side and you have the United States on the other side, you're never going to have peace in the Middle East. We are forgetting completely the humanitarianism of that whole question, where Palestine is the root difficulty in that area.
Mrs. Chisholm, while we have you on the line and changing the subject, getting back to a domestic affair of some moment, why do you believe Senator Kennedy will be the nominee in July, the Democratic nominee?
I have said that on the basis of many things that people are not taking into account, on the basis of the numerous credential challenges that will be put before the convention, to the extent that those challenges are settled satisfactorily or unsatisfactorily, we may have another candidate emerging, or a team of candidates emerging, to keep that convention together. There is no doubt that the challenge by the Illinois delegation, the Alabama and the Mississippi and the Georgia delegations are going to be very hot challenges. How any of the potential nominees of this party is going to react to those challenges is going to be determined to a very large extent as to how some of the delegates are going to be casting their vote at the convention. We have to remember that the delegates that are going to the convention this year are not controlled and manipulable in terms of former delegation. And I think we are not realizing that we are going to have a very open convention. There are going to be some very, very important questions raised before the platform and the credentials committee, and we may have to come up with some compromise candidates. That is why I say it depends on the credentials committee challenges, is why I raised Mr. Kennedy's name.
Well, if in fact the question does come down to a choice between Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern, whom would you support?
I'm not supporting any one man just on the basis of supporting a man. I'm sick and tired of promises and rhetoric, and a lot of people are in this country. I think it's important to see what the team would be like. I would be very much interested in seeing who would be with Mr. Humphrey and who will be with Mr. McGovern in terms of the team. The vice presidency in this country is becoming very, very important, and we just can't depend on thinking in terms of the top person on the ticket without giving some consideration to the second person on the ticket. So I am not a person going to make a unilateral decision just on that basis.
Well, would you like to be on Senator Humphrey's team?
Pardon?
Would you like to be on Senator Humphrey's team, Mrs. Chisholm?
I would have to say it would depend on what develops at the convention. There's many things that are unforeseen right now that are going to develop at that convention, and so I'm not going to say whose team or what team I would like to be on. I just want to make sure that when all of these gentlemen start negotiating and the power blocks start moving at the convention, that I can be in there telling them to remember the people just a little bit.
Let me broaden that question, Mrs. Chisholm. Forget the personality. If your own candidacy for the top spot should fail, would you actively seek to be on the ticket? Are you now saying that you think you could serve as Vice President of the United States, strengthening the ticket?
I could serve as President of this country, believe it or not.
Well, I phrased my question badly.
That's what you're a candidate
Let me go back and
That's why I'm running.
Let me go back and try it again. Would you like to be on the ticket, whether it's the first or second spot, if you failed in the first spot?
You just cannot be on a ticket, period. There are many, many things that would have to be answered. The platform, what the platform is going to be. What are the commitments to the person who will be the top person, who will be the nominee. It's not just being on the ticket. This country has gotten to the point where we have to make sure that whatever ticket we put together addresses itself after the convention would have been over to the needs and the hopes and the aspirations of many people that have been waiting for the fulfillment of the American dream. So it's not just being on the ticket per se. There's several other factors that have to be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Mrs. Chisholm.
You're welcome.
Mayor Yorty, at this point in the race for the nomination, I'm bound to say you have no real chance to capture it. In the California poll, the most recent one taken and published just a couple of days ago, you lost half your support. You were 2% on May 1st, and you were 1% on May 31st. Why are you here? What are you up to?
Well, I'm here because I think somebody should speak up for California. And, of course, I haven't had the tremendous amounts of money like Senator McGovern has or the amounts that Senator Humphrey has had, so I haven't really been able to reach the people. I would like to have the California delegation, though, go with me to Miami Beach and see that the problems of California, our defense industries, our aerospace industries, that these are protected.
Well, the winner of the primary gets all the California delegates, doesn't he? Doesn't the winner of the primary get all the California delegates?
That's right, and I would certainly like to have that delegation. It's been very hard for me without a lot of money and with the media attitude where I was foreclosed even from appearing in my own state where I've been mayor of the largest city for 11 years, until we got a court order. And I want to thank Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm because she did better in the Washington federal court than we did out here. And only due to her lawsuit am I here at all. I think if I had had a chance to talk about the Middle East and Southeast Asia and the other problems, the problems of California, I would have had a much better chance. I happen, for instance, in the Middle East, to have studied it for a very long time. I've conferred with the refugees there. I tried to talk to
Mayor, the question is,
would you know, I want to tell you something for Mrs. Chisholm.
The question is, if you have no delegates, what do you hope to broker in Miami Beach?
Well, I'm not trying to broker.
What are you going to sell there?
I'm not trying to broker anything. If I win the delegates here, then I will see to them, and if I couldn't be nominated, that whoever is will be interested in California's problems within the context of the problems of the United States. But I just want to say this one thing to Mrs. Chisholm because she mentioned these refugees. I have conferred with them. I was at Jericho and talked to the leaders, the Mukhtars, in 1954. And I asked them, would you take money or resettlement and get out of these camps. And they said, we're taking blood oaths to drive the Jews into the sea. And so as far as the Middle East is concerned, I want to just add this one thing. I don't filibuster, that we will not have to go into the Middle East if only the Arabs are the opponents of the Israelis, because they can beat the Arabs. But if the Russians should join in it, then that's another story. And in that case, unless we have a credible deterrent, the Russians might go in. But if we're strong and don't disarm unilaterally, as Senator McGovern wants to, if we do that, I think the Russians might be tempted. But if we're strong, I don't think they'll be tempted, and the Israelis can handle the Arabs.
I think that this may be an appropriate time to bring up a situation illustrated by this program. As a matter of fact, television's problem with equal time in trying to inform the American people about the process of selecting their president, which is a very important responsibility for us. The law says that any candidate, regardless of his or her strength, or whatever evidence there is of popular support, must be given time equal to front-running candidates on all but regularly scheduled news programs. You are here, Mayor Yorty, and Mrs. Chisholm, you were in New York with your 1% and 2% in the California poll, arguing with Senator McGovern and Senator Humphrey and Governor Wallace's representative, who have substantially higher standings. Do you think this law is right or wrong, good or bad, for political education in this country? Let's begin with you, Senator Humphrey.
Yes, I think it is. I do. I think that people have to have the right to be heard. You never know whether or not you're a 2% candidate. Senator McGovern here was a 5% candidate not long ago, and look where he is. I think that you can't judge people on the basis of that percentage. They have a right to be heard. But I want to say something now about this format. I wanted some debates with Senator McGovern. And we had one, and the first one on another network, we had a sort of a one. A couple of days later,
on this one, were it not for the ruling.
A couple of days later, that was a much stricter and a much more inflexible format. But in order to get those debates down where I'd like to, so that the people of California can know just exactly where we stand, I'm asking Senator McGovern now to join me on Monday night for another hour of debate. We'll divide up the cost, George. You pay half, I pay half. You got more money than I got. I'll sacrifice a little bit here, and we can go right at it, hook and tong, and we can discuss it as two senators would without any personal animosity, and I want that very clear. We have none. And really go at it and let the people know our differences on some of these views, and also let them know how we feel that Mr. Nixon ought to be defeated. I think we can do it. So I just offer you now the chance. We just go out and buy an hour at a time. Monday night, you put your people to work, I put my people to work. Since we can't get a real debate here, let's do one on Monday. How about it?
I think that's fine. Can I answer?
Sure, go ahead, Senator.
I think that's fine. I hope that in addition to debates between Senator Humphrey and myself, that whichever one of us gets the nomination, or if it's somebody else, if it's Mrs. Chisholm or Mr. Yorty or Governor Wallace or whoever it is, that when the fall elections come along, I hope President Nixon will participate in debates. He, after all, is the real issue before the country today. The question of whether we're going to continue under another 4 years of the Nixon administration, or whether we're going to move on to something new. So I'm happy to debate with Senator Humphrey anytime it can be worked out.
May I interrupt for just a moment?
Can I ask, so we get this one kind of pinned down, George, can you tell your people to work out?
Yes, we've made a commitment to
3 debates.
To some other things on Monday, but I think we can probably adjust that. And
that's a good idea.
Let's see if we can't work it out.
Let me see what the moving here. I didn't mean to break into the news portion, but I have a problem with your answer, Senator Humphrey. On one hand, you say, yes, you think the court ruling was fair, and it was fair certainly never to exclude people. Second hand, you said you wanted to debate, and you understand now that you couldn't have it here, and you also understand, and I'm not speaking for ABC, networks in the future will be very loath to invite 2 people when there are so many in the race, and they know that the courts may very well require that others be there. You've invited Senator McGovern to pay for time.
Oh, I'm going to pay for half.
Now, you know that the other candidates, if they can come up with the money, will have to be included. If they can buy the time,
they would
not.
No, we can buy the law does not prevent 2 candidates.
No, that's true, but the television station must sell time to them in an equal
right.
way.
That's the problem of the television station.
We have they don't have the money. How are you bringing your question round to its beginning, how are the American people really then getting a chance to examine all of the candidates?
Mr. Donaldson, that is a problem, but I do not see any other way than to support the court ruling, inconvenient as it is. And I do want to subscribe to what has been said here about the importance in the general election of the networks being able to provide its amount of free time for the candidates for president in the general election. And I mean free time. Yes. You have a public license. You're on the air primarily because you get a public license out of the Federal Communications Commission. And I believe that President Nixon and Hubert Humphrey ought to be debating on the...
You know that the Congress has already turned down the major effort to abolish 315 for presidential debates this year.
Yes, I haven't had a chance to comment on that question
yet. Go ahead. I want everybody to comment.
Pardon?
I want everybody to comment, and we are running out of time.
What I think is fair is to keep the rule as it is for the primaries. I think that any place where a candidate can file for the presidency and meet the requirements of state law, that he's entitled to free time during that primary. Once the nominees of the various parties have been selected, then I would like to see some modification in Rule 315 so that the voters would have a chance to hear the principal candidates in face-to-face competition. Now, ordinarily, that would mean the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate. If we have a third or fourth party that has demonstrated in the previous election that it has at least 5% of the vote, or if they didn't run in the previous election, if they can get 5% of the electorate to sign a petition, I would give that third or fourth party equal time too. But that would then get us down to the point where we could have a fair exchange.
Mrs. Chisholm, I assume that you're in favor of the court ruling that put you in that chair.
Oh, I most certainly am, but I would like to go back to something Senator Humphrey said, because he was very interested that after the ruling was handed down, Senator Humphrey did indicate some feelings with respect to the fact that myself and Senator Yorty, who are not the front runners, would, be taking away maybe some possible valuable time from himself and George. I would just like to say this, that I think this is exactly what's wrong with American politics. Unless you can buy and unless you have the money, people that have ability, innovation, creativity in terms of putting new solutions into how government must work are left out. And after all, as Senator Humphrey was just saying to Senator McGovern, well, George, you and I should be able to get together and get some time for Monday night. Well, that's good if George and Hubert can work it out. But after all, Hubert has been a part of the national leadership in this country for the past 8 years. I think most of the American people pretty well knows where Hubert is on many views, so I don't think that is really the issue.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chisholm. Mrs. Chisholm and gentlemen, we have come to that point in the program where we are going to have to begin our summaries. I'm going to give each one of you a minute, and at the end of each minute, I'm going to cut you off because we are now to that point. So we'll begin with Mayor Yorty.
Well, first of all, let me say that election is not decided by polls. And Hubert, I'm a little bit surprised that proposition you made. I don't think anybody would watch because you and Senator McGovern spent 25 minutes the other night discussing who turned against the war first. And if I could have been in there, you'd have had a different point of view on that. There's been no discussion here today about the great supersonic transport program, of the American program. If I'm in the debate, I would force some discussion of that. So I think it's sort of a meaningless debate when two people who seem to have so much the same views are there. And you're trying to exclude me after all. No matter what the polls say, I am the mayor of by far the largest city in Los Angeles, and I would like the opportunity to debate with you so-called self-appointed frontrunners the issues that are important to California.
Thank you very much, Mayor Yorty. Next on the list, Senator Humphrey.
Well, I want to get this nomination and to be the President of the United States because I am deeply concerned about many things in this country. I think it's time that this country of ours understood that the government was to be one of the people, not government for government or government for a privileged few. I believe that the 1970s is a decade in which we can do great things for tax reform, to give some equity and justice in taxes, and I want to lead that fight, in which we can really do something about meaningful work to build this country rather than just having people be satisfied or told that they're going to get unemployment compensation. I think it's time to take a look at our cities and make them livable and really make them worthy of the American people and the American dream. I think it's time to take care of our elderly in a way that they don't have to live in poverty, and to love our children enough to really take care of them in health and education. I think what this country needs is faith, it needs confidence, we need trust in each other, and we really need an abiding fellowship amongst all of us with dedicated leadership and courage to really lead and not just to follow.
Senator McGovern?
Mr. Reynolds, first of all, I'm grateful for the format of this broadcast today. This is the third one of these discussions we've held. I've noticed that on all three networks, all of the panelists have been males, all of the guests have been males. Today, for the first time, we have a woman in Mrs. Chisholm, and I think it's added an interesting and bright note to our discussion. It's my hope that as we move into 1972, the issues will be discussed in terms of some of the new opportunities that are ahead of this country, so that we do not feel that we have to depend on war as a means of providing jobs. We don't have to depend on SSTs and ABMs and make-work enterprises of that kind, but that we can be about the business of building up the real strength of this country. Of course, we want to be militarily strong, but we also want to recognize that the moral and the economic and the social strength of this country is of equal importance.
Thank you, Senator. Mrs. Chisholm?
I've never been more serious in my life in terms of seeking this highest office. Of course, because of the traditionalism with respect to this highest office, my candidacy has been accepted as a joke by many people. But after traveling 7 months around this country, I find a malaise across this land that is very disturbing. And if nothing else, although I'm literally and figuratively the dark horse in this race, we're going to try to keep them honest at the convention. We're going to try to remind them how important it is for them to remember the needs of the people of this country, the needs of the people whose tax dollars are constantly being wasted and not being utilized for their benefit. Because when they start bargaining, when they start getting together, you find quite often the people to whom they've gone to secure their votes become actually meaningless. I have been at too many conventions to know exactly what happens when you go down the pike. So I am here running very, very hard, running also to keep them honest, to keep them on their toes, and also to be an instrument for those who are usually helpless at a national convention.
Thank you, Mrs. Chisholm. Mr. Hardin, speaking for Governor Wallace.
I'm grateful that you would allow me to appear here today and participate on behalf of Governor Wallace. And I'd like to say with all the sincerity at my command that despite all this talk of front runner here today, that I do believe that in George Wallace, we have the front runner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. I base that on the fact that he has won more primaries than any other candidate here are in the race. He leads by 1 million votes in the popular vote, where the people have had an opportunity to express themselves in referendum. He, I believe, is going to the convention with a predominant position, and I believe that the political leadership in this country, in the Democratic Party, those leaders are going to have to come to grips with reality that in George Wallace, they do have the instrument and the means of recapturing the presidency in November. And after all, I think everyone here today has agreed that that is the primary objective of the democratic process. I believe that very shortly the realization will come to the leadership of the party and the leadership in the various states where the party prevails at this moment, that George Wallace is their instrument and that they will turn to him, that he will have the Democratic nomination, and having it, I have every confidence that he can go on for election in November.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hardin. Well, our time is up. We have tried to be fair and equal in the distribution of time here. I'm not sure that we've succeeded completely, but it's been interesting, and we have been very pleased to have you, all of you, this crowd, on ABC's Issues and Answers today. For Sam Donaldson and Bill Matney, this is Frank Reynolds in Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This program originated at the studios of KABC-TV in Los Angeles. Next Tuesday, we'll see the ballots cast in two hard-fought Western primaries, California and New Mexico. What happens on Tuesday may well decide what happens at the Democratic Convention in July. So join Howard K. Smith and Harry Reasoner as they bring you the results and analyze them Tuesday night.